Everybody, this is Perch. Judging comic sales these days, quite difficult. You've got multiple distributors in play. The numbers aren't being shared like they used to. And the hard part is that, a lot of sites have moved from fairly precise numbers that they were getting, albeit they're, always missing stuff like digital, and sometimes the reorders didn't show up properly and everything else, but they were pretty accurate. And now it's moved to a estimate model. And the estimate model is based on kind of one premise. And this is where a lot of people crap on John Jackson Miller, who's over there at Comicron. I think he's a good guy. I think he's doing great work, and he puts in a lot of effort. And more importantly, and this is where you got to separate the kind of, for lack of a better word, the people who are honestly trying to do good from scammers. I think Miller, I don't agree with I don't agree with the way he's doing his estimates, the logic, but he is saying he's doing estimates. He's not hiding that fact, and he largely shows his math. He shows you how he gets there. So if you disagree, he's laying it out for you. And this is a kind of relationship that I wish more of us had with each other, where it's like, I don't agree with your premise, but I love the work you did, and you're not lying about it. You're not being dishonest about what you're doing. And so I mean, I consider you a huge asset to comics, and I think he's a great guy. Uh, you could disagree with the premise of something and still, find value in what the person is doing. And I think that's where a lot of the comic numbers are right now. He shows his math. I'll show mine. Why don't I agree with the current kind of estimates and the calculations going on? Well, mainly because I think there's been some significant changes over the last 3 years in terms of how comics are being bought, where they're being sold, the models in which they're being sold, the discounting that's being taken place. And just, I think that a lot of the estimates that you're seeing are based on historical precedent. It's based on how comics have been sold up to 2020. And I think that would be a fine model if the world was operating like it was in 2020, but it is not. And a lot of comic shops have pivoted and changed their methods. I think that the numbers index high. I am not just to be clear, I'm not one of those people saying comics is absolutely dying and nothing is selling. Obviously, things are selling. But I think that the world of pre-2020 was a slightly more reliable world in terms of, you could see what was going out. You could make some calculations based on what was going to happen the following month. And you're seeing a lot more comics, rise and drop more rapidly. I'd say you're seeing more speculation in the market, which is harder to predict and thus, interferes with the model. And anyway, I should interview the guy at some point, but not debate him. I don't have no interest in debating him because I think, unfortunately, both of what we're saying are guesses. I think he's had a lot of experience, a lot of statistical experience, so I think his guesses are probably pretty good. But I still, I disagree with parts of the model. I could be wrong, and I'd be happy to admit that. But it's not really a debate because there's not really a way to win. Now, maybe it'd be interesting for people to hear the different sides. But anyway, that's how I see it. But anyway, comic numbers are hard, I guess is my point. There's information that you can find out there, but it is very much a guess and an estimate at this point. And you just need to know that going in. Doesn't mean it's useless, but means, you're not going in with completely factual information. So there's a question I got, and it's on a recent comic, and here goes. It says, Dear Perch, is DC versus vampires a success? Now, you may be wondering why that whole lead up. Actually, it's completely related. So, you could stop with the, whatever, video starts at 4 minutes and 12 seconds. Actually, it's connected because the mail continues. To be clear, I mean a sales success for stores or DC. I was wondering this question because of the solicitations from the tie-ins, and a couple of months ago, All Out War, Hunters and Killers, not written by Tinian or art by Schmidt, but written by Matt Rosenberg, the co-writer on the main series. Are the tie-ins, about 4 issues so far, a sign of success and reaction to strong early sales? Are these tie-ins only to fill the gap between main series to keep up interest? There was a pause between April and June, yet 2 of them will be published alongside the main series. Yeah, there's some kind of bizarre scheduling hiccup. I think DC is doing this where they have these series. You see it on White Knight as well. And they want to take a breather kind of right in the middle to allow things to catch up, and also to take a moment in the story where you've built up a lot of dramatic tension to maybe introduce something new that helps expand the universe. It's a good sales, good technique. I think DC has been adopting it, but it also helps fill the gap. So you have basically a title on the month, on the shelf every month. But with DC versus Vampires, it feels like that got screwed up somehow because they do have a gap, and there are titles coming out, but it doesn't. It feels like I don't know, supply chain, whatever you want to call it. The things got shifted somehow, and so it doesn't feel like it's as precise as it used to be. Anyway, so this goes on, but. The first answer to your question and why I did the lead up that I did is that all indications say that DC versus Vampires is a success. And by success, that's a moving target. It's not like a 1990 success. It's not selling 1 million copies. Doesn't seem like it's broken 100,000. But in the current context of what DC puts out, it has been a success. In many ways, the way comic shops are describing it is not as strong as Deceased, but it's close. It's getting up there. Now, Deceased was a runaway hit and did extremely well in trade and digital and a lot of the other formats beyond print. So it's very popular, and it's why DC has greenlit, more series and other things with it, and why there will undoubtedly be more in that universe. But DC versus Vampires was kind of James Tynion on his way out of the company into his Substack and other things that he's up to. And so working on this with Matt Rosenberg, a guy who's had some success at Marvel, but is trying to find his footing over there at DC. And it was, in many ways, it was popular. Of course it's going to be popular. You took the DC characters, you made a couple of them evil, and there you go. I mean, it's really about that simple. And it's almost what the comic model that tends to just be very, very successful is it's almost a Civil War approach. It's like get the heroes fighting each other, get the heroes to a point where some have been turned bad, and then we can mash them up and have that work. So it's working. Again, I've seen different estimates out there. I think this title is probably doing around 60 to 70,000. Which, again, in today's context is really, really good. Now, I've seen numbers that are much lower, but I'm also looking at Facebook groups and other places where they're trying to get comics in and where there's under orders, and it seems to be very, very strong. And so DC's happy with it, and the tie-ins, I think, they most likely had a plan to do tie-ins when they do these kinds of series. They get them ready to do. But they don't pull the trigger until they get kind of the initial issue 1 sales, and then those sales are strong and it works. DC versus Vampires also fits into kind of DC's overall strategy of, hey, none of this story is going to matter long term. It's an Elseworlds multiversal kind of story. It's we don't have to worry about continuity and that other stuff, and eventually we can put it in a nice hardcover and sell it in the bookstore as a trade, and very clean, very easy. So DC likes these kinds of series. And it's working for them, and it has been a sales success for, again, in the context of where comics are right now. And you can't knock that, and good for Tynion and Rosenberg. So anyway, the mail goes on a little bit more. It says, I like the book so far, particularly for Otto Schmidt's interiors. He was one of the 2 main artists for Ben Percy's Green Arrow Rebirth run. So seeing his Green Arrow art in action again feels great. Yeah, I agree. I miss that run. That was a good run, actually. Plus, if memory serves, it's Tynion's last work for DC, at least until his Marvel DC contract expires. His Marvel contract expires? And it's a good first impression for me. I'm not sure what is going on here. Anyway, I'm not sure about that. As a relatively new reader, I thought of tie-ins as usually for the big events, like Death Metals and Darkest Night. So as DC versus Vampires, was a fun side series, now an important part of the publishing line. As a 12-issue series, it certainly stands out from the glut of 6-issue minis DC was rolling out when it started. Personally, these tie-ins don't interest me, but as a reader, I'm curious how well the series is performing. My only real gauge is a channel of casually comics issue-by-issue reviews, so I'm curious to hear what, if anything, you've heard about the sales and reaction, or if you have any impression on the series. Cool. Then P.S., sorry to hear about the Texas muffler extinction. You must be exhausted. Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, like I said, it is a success. I think that it is definitely the deceased model of this, and I think you're going to see more of these kind of encapsulated 12 issue events. If DC believes they can greenlight a series, it's relatively self-contained, pump out 12 issues, be able to capture additional money in the back market with the digital and trade, be able to throw in a couple tie-ins to further capitalize a couple kind of easy money issues. They're going to do that all day long, and in many ways, I think and I'd love this would be a great financial analysis. I believe stuff like this, when it hits, is probably more financially successful for them than the events that they do. Now, make no mistake about it, the events usually sell more, but they're also logistically tougher. They tend to pay more for the team that's on it, and it's just it winds up at times cannibalizing other books in the line. Whereas this kind of stuff like Deceased and now DC versus Vampires, it feels like a pretty easy, pretty clean book that they can roll out somewhat in its own sandbox. Again, very similar to White Knight, very similar to some of the other stuff that they've done, and I think you're going to see more of it. It's an easier thing to logistically schedule, put talent around, and if it does poorly, it's very easy to pull the plug. It gets to live and die on its own in somewhat of a box. So it's doing well, and I think that the tie-ins are a natural kind of cause and effect. In terms of do I like the series, I do. I am enjoying it. I mean, of the comics I read every month, I think that one's probably more positive than negative for me. I think it's the story feels a little bit like something I've seen several times before because it is this classic example of like, hey, all the heroes and the heroes are supposed to do good, but what if some of the heroes went bad and then they were vampires and then they tried to take over the world? It's like, I don't know, I feel like I've read several of those stories in other places, either through comic books or actual books. I mean, we've seen it in movies. There's some abysmal Netflix series that was trying to do this with vampires. It was just awful. You have The Strain. The Strain was different, but I think that this is a case where we've seen this story before, but it's a repeated classic because it works because people show up and they pay money for it. So I think it's fine. I like the art. I like the general story. I think they're doing some interesting things. It is nice that they took some of the bigger names off the board early in the comic, and then this has given them the chance to put some other faces up there. I think that's interesting. I'm curious how that plays out. So a lot of fans always say they want that. They want Nightwing to get spotlighted as a big bad of the entire universe and get some of these other characters that often don't get the same level of attention. But then when they do that, people don't show up to buy it. Now DC is about to experiment with that in a pretty major way with Dark Crisis and this idea of like, hey, the B list or the next generation is going to have to step up. Now, all early indications are that thing's gonna do poorly. That's how it's certainly looking. In this case, we'll see what happens with DC Vampire, but I think that there's more enthusiasm for a 12 issue. I mean, it's just easier to wrap your head around rather than an event with a bunch of kind of random tie-ins and how does that connect to continuity. Anyway, all good stuff. So thank you very much for the question. Thanks for letting me ramble on a little bit about sales numbers and everything else. And to all of you, thanks for listening.